God can bring grace out of the crucifixion, then God can bring grace out of anything. And so our task is to go back when we have the luxury of going back, as we do now with the safety of vaccines and new drugs, of new treatment protocols. We now have a breather. It may be a brief one. We've had that happen before. We may not be through with this yet, but we've learned some important things, and it's time for us to glean the best of what we've learned. And if we look carefully at these experiences, we learn a lot of things. Many of us in this room went through a similar learning experience during the worldwide AIDS pandemic. That didn't touch everybody in this room as closely and as powerfully as this pandemic did, as the COVID pandemic did, but it did impact a lot of our life and a lot of our culture. And we would despair if we couldn't go back and find some grace in that experience. And I would venture that much of the progress that we have made in the human community is a result of the AIDS, in matters of gender and sexuality, are the result of the AIDS pandemic. As a gay man who lived through the educational process within the Episcopal Church, I was ordained in 1975, so from the time I entered seminary in 1970 until we actually came to grips with it and passed canonical legislation that took these issues seriously, I was engaged in lots of conversations with people, and I often said this world would be a very different place if all gay and lesbian people turned green overnight. And then a pandemic came along and did exactly that. It did exactly that. It unmasked a lot of people. And for better or for worse, for good or for ill, I choose to see the good in it on this side and say the advances we made were made because suddenly families and institutions could no longer ignore the reality, nor could the individuals. We all had to come to terms with this aspect of our incarnation, of our bodily lives, and we had to deal with it. And I'm proud to say that our church rose to that occasion, painfully, with a lot of destruction and a lot of stuff that went down the pike, but we did, and we will continue to reap what we have sustained and suffered over the last 2 years in this pandemic. In God's economy, no experience is ever wasted. These are not 2 years lost out of our lives. These are 2 years jam-packed with some very powerful learning. And one of the things that's unique to human beings, maybe not unique, but at least we're sentient enough to be able to reflect on it. One of the things that is characteristic of human beings is that we tend to learn better to appreciate by being deprived. You don't appreciate having food until you're hungry. You don't appreciate having sleep and rest until you have insomnia or work that prevents you from resting properly. You don't realize the gift of children a lot of times until they leave home. And you suddenly look back and realize in the peace that follows that 18-year stint of nonstop crisis, until you look back and realize how much you gained from that. The same thing with having to living one's life with other human beings. The grace and the gift of the moment of being in that relationship is often lost to us until it's taken from us. So this experience is a time for us, and that was why I was recommending that this Lent was a good time to begin thinking about that. What have we learned out of this? And what gift do we bring forward out of this? There are some that have been manifested and made known to us, and there are others yet to be identified. Anybody else want to make a comment? Yes, ma'am.
I don't like microphones.
Speak up so I can hear you.
Oh, there. I don't like microphones. I think you can't really call it a gift or a grace, maybe kind of, sort of, but I don't think any attention would have been given to George Floyd had we all not been locked down and watching TV. And I think the whole Black Lives movement had space to grow and had space for teaching people who would otherwise be distracted by whatever celebrity moment or a TikTok or whatever. I think Black Lives Matter probably gained a lot of traction.
Yes, I think you're right.
For the good.
I think that one of the images, one of the strongest images out of the COVID-19 pandemic is the image of containment. Containment. So much of our lives was ordered by containment. We were trying to prevent the spread of this disease, and it meant that we were contained, we were confined, confinement and containment. We were forced into closer relationships with the people that we already had in our lives, and that meant that the pandemic forcibly removed a lot of the distractions that deflect the attention that we should have been giving all along to our marriages and our families and our children. It also, I'm sure, it must have heightened every parent's appreciation of education and people who devote their lives to education. I'm serious. My husband was an elementary school teacher, and we followed with great interest. Look at all of the action that came out of public school unions and teachers unions, teacher systems, all the service personnel, all the unions that serve police, fire, public educators. There was so much more activity, and it was so much more public because that was all amplified and pressurized within this pressure cooker that we were all put in. And there are positive benefits out of that. And as you remarked, the whole issue of racism, which was so diffuse before the pandemic came, was now concentrated in events that lived beyond the usual 3-day news cycle and continue to live and continue to be important touchstones that we have to go back to, but we can't ignore. So those are more of those positive learnings. Yes, one more, and then I'm going to shift and give us some comments on the lectionary.
I also think the perspective has been very different since COVID, which I think isn't obvious, but I'm someone who's taken the Landmark Forum, and I stood up in this classroom, and I was probably 22, and I remember they said, look around you, those of you that are under 23, like under 23, 24, these are your parents. And it was a perspective that with COVID happening, I think it was a time for people of my generation, I'm 35 and younger, to really learn to slow down and focus in alternative areas, and then the older generations to learn the technology, and then the respect of meeting in the middle between the two, since people that are older than around 50 can be higher risk, and just to really give us a chance to see who we can rely on, who we want to be there for, and then reflect on, our families and the people we love that are maybe high risk, and take care in that, and then people who had differing opinions. It really gave you a perspective that was very unique and different that we wouldn't have had without COVID.
Thank you. That touches upon a subject that I believe I have discussed with you in previous forums over the years, that one of the most powerful forces that we have been tasked to live with and through in this culture is atomization. The atomization of human life. And it manifests itself in many ways. Part of it manifests itself in the contention between the political parties and the social groups, the haves and the have-nots. The political climate that we live in, the cultural climate that we live in, if you think about it, all the forces have been arrayed in the last 50 to 100 years. All the forces of our society have been arrayed and designed to work at keeping us apart and keeping us at enmity with one another. All of our products are sold out of fear of missing out, fear of losing out, fear of not keeping up. So much has been built, so many of these forces of fear and anger and disruption have been designed precisely to break down and break up community. And what is the distinctive characteristic of Christianity? It's the world's largest community modeled on human family relationship. It begins, every one of our creeds begins, we believe in a God who created everything, period. And that one statement links every single life, not only every single human life, but every life bound up in the creation. And if you don't think the creation has a life, take a course in geology. I suffered that in college. Take a course in botany. In botany, if you don't finish botany 1 with a sense that plants actually have souls, there's something missing from your botany class. I mean, you begin when you learn how plants react to the environment around them, they begin to take on characteristics that are uncannily human. And the same thing happens to the elements of the earth. The entire earth behaves in certain ways, and those ways impact us, and we don't even think about it until we're inconvenienced or deprived. So yes, one of the things that comes out of this is we have been forced by this pandemic to come to terms with relationship in an entirely new way, and that's a really good thing. That we've learned to listen across generations and across genders, and we're still learning, and we'll constantly be learning how to relate across the various divisions. I hate using the term race because it's a human construct. There's only one race, it's human. The human race. Okay? Any other race is a false construct. It's something we made up. Okay? And we have to be aware of that, and we have to ponder that, and we have to parse it and see, ask the hard questions. Why did we do that, and what use does it have now? It still continues to have certain uses, but it's one of those very difficult things to deal with. I mean, each one of us has to struggle with finding our identity. And finding my identity meant embracing certain things about me that make me uniquely who I am. One of those was one of the things that made me a pariah in this society for so long, and that is that I am a gay man. Okay? I had to deal with that if I had been, and I'm also a white man who has black blood somewhere in the family tree, because anybody whose ancestors grew up in Sicily probably had some ancestry that came from the continent of Africa and from the Middle East, because those darker cultures actually ruled the country that my grandparents came from for many years. And they took wives and they begat children. So we're learning that we're all connected exactly as our creeds have maintained since they were first written. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The only part of the creed that you really have to memorize and never forget is that first line that appears in all of them, that we all believe in a God who made everything. You just say that and live by that, and it's sufficient. On that sentence, on that principle hangs all the law, the prophets, the gospels, all of it. It all hangs on that. And that's the heart of who we are. Now, we shifted today, and some people remarked on it and noticed that we shifted and we left Luke, we thought. We just started reading from John's Gospel when Jesus comes to Bethany, and that episode that takes place in John's Gospel takes us now, it begins a period in the life of our lectionary where we will be hearing from John. And John's Gospel, we believe, is the last one that was compiled. That doesn't mean it's the last Gospel, because I just told you that you're still writing yours. Okay. But of the collected scriptures, John's Gospel is the youngest one. It was the one most recently written. And the other three synoptics were written before that, and there's strong scholarship to suggest that many of Paul's letters were perhaps, many of the letters that are bound up in what we call the Christian scriptures in the New Testament, they were probably written in that period before John's Gospel as well. And I think it's important for us to look at John's Gospel because John is so characteristic of John's Gospel. The way he treats Judas in the reading this morning is so characteristic. I mean, if John or the community that wrote John's Gospel was given the Myers-Briggs test, they would have the biggest honkin' J you've ever seen. They are so judgmental. And John could not resist taking a swipe at Judas. Couldn't resist it. He acknowledges a truth and then undermines it in the same sentence. Because he says that Judas, who was the one about to betray him, he says that Judas was the one who kept the common purse but stole from it. Basically what it meant if you read about Judas and you read about the disciples, Judas was the one that was trusted by the community to hold the money and be the accountant. He was the one who was so trustworthy that they gave him stewardship over the treasury. So the authors of this gospel acknowledged that, but they have to smear Judas and say, but he stole from it. Okay. They have to impugn his motives. And we have to be aware of the fact that this is, if we're going to listen to John, we have to balance John with some of the things that we hear about the community from the other source, which may have or may not have shared a common authorship with the Gospel of Luke. It is commonly believed that many of the hands that crafted Luke's Gospel also crafted the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, the opening of the Acts of the Apostles begins, O Theophilus, in my first account, the Gospel of Luke, I said thus, this, and so. And this is the second account. And I remember commenting when I was with you several weeks ago that the thing that's unique about, most interesting about the combination of Luke and Acts is that Luke is essentially a biography of Jesus and Acts is essentially a biography of the Christian church. And they align with one another in many respects. Many of the stories that are told out of the life of Jesus align with the stories that are told out of the life of the community that grew out of the life of Jesus. And so they are structurally similar too. But here is another thing that is very important to know about these Gospels, and that is that the Gospel of John is a political document. You hear references to the reality of the community in some of the epistles, Remember the epistle where it says, some of you are loyal to Cephas, and some of you belong to other congregations that have formed around other apostolic personalities. Okay? Well, this is how it manifests itself. It was going bad long before Constantine. It was, the apples in the barrel were going bad from a very early date. And we see it in the contention. It's one of the reasons I believe that when the Gospels were brought together, we were given 4 conflicting accounts intentionally. Intentionally. It was an intentional act to make sure that the variety of voices got heard, and that future generations would be left to iron out those differences, which are still among us and still haven't been totally ironed out. But if you want some really interesting reading, I'm going to recommend to you, I wrote them down, they're in here somewhere. I'm going to recommend 2 books to you that you read side by side, and if I don't find them right now, I can give you the basic information off the top of my head. One is a book by a Jewish scholar named Samuel Sandmel, and the title of the book, I believe, is it's basically a history of Jewish and Christian communities in the 1st century BC, AD. The first 100 years, that period when Christianity, which began as a sect of Judaism, is separating from the mother community and taking on a life of its own. And one of the communities that grew out of that movement was the community of the beloved disciple, and Raymond Brown. Raymond Brown wrote a book called The Community of the Beloved Disciple. And if you read those 2 books, Raymond Brown's book about the community of the beloved disciple, the community that grew up around the figure of John, and Samuel Sandmel's writing about the communities of Christianity and Judaism that coexisted during the same period. You learn worlds about the institution we call the church, and it's fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating how much we share in common and how much we brought over. A lot more came over from Judaism than we thought, and a lot was happening in Judaism that was influenced by what was happening in that Christian sect that broke away. Okay. So it's fascinating to read, but it also opens our eyes to the reality that there are biases in these books. And as you're listening to John, be attuned and attentive to the slams. Because Peter looks like a total idiot in John's gospel. Whereas in Matthew's gospel, Peter is entrusted with the keys of the kingdom. Okay? Which may have been one of the last additions to that gospel. It may not be original to the text. It may have been a later addition to Matthew's gospel, but in one gospel, Peter is entrusted with the keys to the kingdom and the leadership, and eventually becomes the leader of the church in Rome. Okay? Or the figure around whom the church in Rome coalesced and whose writings were given priority. Before we had 4 gospels that were gathered together, each community had its own gospel. And it formed, their discipleship was dictated by the personality that you glommed onto. Now, Peter had a strong personality, but so did John. And only in John's gospel do we get the notion that John was the beloved disciple. Nothing like patting yourself on your own back. You know, John was the beloved disciple. Says who? John says that he was the beloved disciple. And he gives you lots of evidence by showing that he was given, the seat of honor at, whenever the community gathers. Who's always seated in the place of honor? John, of course. He comes off like like the saint he wanted to be and eventually became. But you see that we see some of the undergarments of the church if we look beyond the surface and see some of the dirty underwear and smelly socks on the body of the church that comes down to us in these books. And that's why I think it's very interesting that we shifted from Luke to John. But we didn't shift entirely because the authorship of Luke's gospel probably had a hand in writing the book of Acts. And if you look very carefully, you're going to see that for this brief period, we do not read the Hebrew scriptures. We may say a psalm every Sunday between now and Pentecost, but you're not going to hear from the Old Testament again until after Pentecost. Because the Old Testament readings are being supplanted now by readings from the book of Acts. So going forward after Easter, you're going to be spending a lot of time in Acts. And you should be paying attention to that. But you're also going to be hearing from John's Gospel. So you're going to have a little more balanced duel going on there between these two different visions of the Christian community as we move toward the event of Pentecost, which we claim to be the birth of the Christian community, the beginning of the Christian community. So I just want to say that if you look at the lectionary going forward, next Sunday is Palm Sunday, as Broderick reminded us this morning. And the entire Passion narrative next week will be from Luke's Gospel, according to the lectionary it will. And that whole narrative is laid out, the whole itinerary of the Easter journey is laid out for us in that one Passion reading. We get the whole thing, okay? So we're going to binge watch the entire series during the service. In the reading of the Gospel next week, we're going to binge watch the entire series. But then in the weeks that follow, we're going to go back and we're going to read it episode by episode. Okay. Which is why you will hear the resonances, because you will have heard it if you were here on Palm Sunday. As the days go forward, you go back and visit individual episodes. And I don't know if you seriously attend to services Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday of Holy Week. I'm sure that they're probably programmed on the schedule, but I encourage you to pay attention to the program. And as Broderick says, if you show up at what time? 7 p.m. You show up at 7 p.m., you'll find something here and somebody here. And you will find on Monday that you get Jesus' movements, the movements that begin toward Jerusalem. That's kind of a recap of the entry into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And you're going to get portions of Isaiah's Songs of the Suffering Servant. So you're going to get some of Isaiah's readings in the week, in Holy Week, and as we move through that week. You're going to get Songs of the Suffering Servant, chapters 42, 49, and 50 out of Isaiah. Why? Because those are the writings that prefigure or give us hints of what the Messiah, how will we identify the Messiah? And these songs are songs that identify at least the suffering characteristic expected of the person who fulfills the name Messiah. On Monday, you get a repeat of today's gospel, that dinner in Bethany. And Tuesday, Jesus, from John's gospel, Jesus contemplates and muses about death and vocation, foreshadowing the crucifixion. And then on Maundy Thursday, you get the story of or the readings in Maundy Thursday pair the institution of the Passover in Exodus, the institution of the Passover, with the Last Supper. But you're going to get the Last Supper from John, which is a very important source to get the Last Supper from, because I want to point out to you that even though Jesus breaks bread with the disciples and shares a common cup with the disciples in the other Gospels, we're the ones who declared that to be the Eucharist. That action was what we declared to constitute the Eucharist. John gives us an alternative. In John's Gospel, the important central action is Jesus washing the feet of the disciples. Okay? And, there are various reasons why we may have come up with the Eucharist, or we may have, centered on the Eucharist. It might have been a simple case of 3 against 1. 3 Gospels against 1 gave us the precedence of the Eucharist. It may have been that washing dirty feet is a lot less aesthetically pleasing than sitting down to a table set with silver vessels, precious vessels, okay? There's the emphasis of Constantine coming back in.
Unless you're a primitive Baptist, they pair, whenever they have communion, they always wash.
They wash feet, see? So that's a gift. I mean, that's something to pay attention to. And there's a lot to be said. Would the church, we can ask the question, would the life of the Christian church be different if we had washed feet as often as we have broken bread? A good question to contemplate. Then we do the great vigil of Easter, in which we get 10 verses of Matthew 28. I believe the only reason we get 10 verses of Matthew 28 is because that is the shortest post-resurrection narrative in the entire Gospels. And if you're doing the full vigil with 9 readings, the last thing you want to do is hear the Passion again in its full entirety. So you get the shortest version of it from Matthew. Then on Easter Day this year, the epistle options are from 1 Corinthians or Acts, so you can maintain the Acts sequence. And the gospel options, very democratic. You can choose between John and Luke and make your own determination on which one you really want to emphasize. But then I want you to pay attention that there are 50 days of Easter. Eastertide is 50 days long. Okay? And so you've got readings that go completely through the Sundays of Eastertide, not to mention the weekdays of Easter. But the readings from the Hebrew Scriptures are again replaced throughout Eastertide. They are replaced by readings from Acts. And on the second Sunday, in Acts, John and the apostle, in Acts, the apostles go up against the high priest, and in John's gospel, Jesus appears to Thomas. Okay. On the second Sunday, that's the Sunday after Easter. On the third Sunday, Saul becomes Paul in the book of Acts, and Jesus breaks bread and has breakfast of fish and bread with disciples on the beach. On the fourth Sunday, Peter resurrects Tabitha. Peter performs a resurrection. So a disciple performs a resurrection. And in the gospel from John, Jesus says, "My sheep hear my voice." On the fifth Sunday from Acts, we get the circumcision controversy is introduced, and we find the community disrupted over whether or not circumcision, are the marks of Judaism going to be required of the new Christians? And much to the relief of all of the men, the ruling was finally determined that no, it was an option. Okay. And in the gospel, we get the love commandment from Jesus to love one another, which is interesting that we get the introduction of a major controversy that almost brought them to fisticuffs in several of their meetings during that period, and it's balanced with the love commandment by Jesus. Then on the sixth Sunday, Paul baptizes the household of Lydia, and the gospel tells us the story of the pool at Bethesda. Two washing narratives side by side. On Ascension Day, we get Luke's version of the Ascension in both Acts and the Gospel. The Ascension is written about in both of those accounts slightly differently. The seventh Sunday, Paul and Silas are jailed and then mysteriously freed by an earthquake or some force that opens the doors in the prison. And that's balanced by one of the most convoluted and difficult texts you'll ever encounter in a gospel, and that's John's very twisted high priestly prayer. That's the one where, it's follow the moving target in this prayer. I mean, you actually have to diagram those sentences to really understand what that prayer is saying. It's partly because of the awkwardness of translating from one language to another, but it's a very complex story or prayer. And then on the day of Pentecost, we get either the story of the Pentecost event from Acts, or we get the story of the Tower of Babel. We get a choice there. And then in the gospel, we get Jesus' final commandment and the promise of the Spirit's coming from John's gospel. So, in summary, the Acts readings recount the post-resurrection activities of the apostles with a spotlight on Paul, and the early spread of Jesus' teaching beyond Jerusalem with mounting conflict between the new adherents of Christianity and religious authority, and the conflicts within the apostolic community itself. The gospel readings largely from John build the case for messiahship through Jesus' incarnate post-resurrection appearances to and encounters with apostles and believers, citing miraculous achievements of those assuming leadership roles written from the perspective of John, or written from the perspective, probably more accurately, the community of the beloved disciple that grew up around John. There are the titles of the books. The Doctrine of the Church, Ecclesiology takes shape, and the title of Samuel's book is called The First Christian Century. The First Christian Century in Judaism and Christianity. The first Christian century, the first century after Christ, in both Judaism and Christianity. And then Raymond Brown's Community of the Beloved Disciple. And after Pentecost, I'm going to conclude with this word. After Pentecost, we have a doctrinal commemoration, Trinity Sunday. And that bridges us into ordinary time, which is anything but ordinary. Because it's all about discipleship and life and community. And if you wonder why discipleship and life in community are one of the great weaknesses of Christian practice, it's because we do all of those readings during the season when the least number of our membership is engaged in the life of the community. I am serious. It's because we've allowed the life of the community to fall prey to the forces of the culture. So, rebels, rebel. God grant you a very blessed Holy Week and a most joyous Easter. Thank you.